The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Al Mansour mansion in Beverly Hills, each drop a sharp reminder that even California's perpetual sunshine had its limits. Inside, the marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, reflecting a wealth that most people would never comprehend in their lifetimes. But money, as the saying goes, can't buy everything, and certainly not peace. 12-year-old Faisal Al Mansour stood in the center of the grand living room, arms crossed, dark eyes blazing with calculated defiance. Around him lay the wreckage of his latest tantrum: broken porcelain from a Ming vase, scattered books, and an overturned side table. The boy's designer clothes, a pristine white Ralph Lauren shirt and tailored navy trousers, remained immaculate, as if the chaos he'd created hadn't touched him at all. "You're just like all the others," Faisal said, his accent a peculiar blend of British boarding school polish and American entitlement. "Weak, pathetic." Mrs. Henderson, the latest in a long line of nannies, stood near the marble staircase with tears streaming down her weathered face. She was a woman in her 50s, gray-haired and dignified, who'd come with impeccable references from families across Europe. Yet here she was, clutching her handbag, her dignity in tatters after only 4 days. I will not tolerate this behavior any longer," she managed, her British accent trembling. "Your father may pay extraordinarily well, but no amount of money is worth this abuse." Faisal's lips curved into a smile that held no warmth. "Then leave. They all do." From his study down the hall, Abdullah Al-Mansour heard the commotion but didn't emerge. The 45-year-old Saudi oil magnate had built an empire through steel nerves and strategic thinking, but his son had become a problem he couldn't solve with business acumen or wealth. Since Faisal's mother had died 3 years ago in a car accident in Riyadh, the boy had transformed from a somewhat spoiled child into something darker: angry, manipulative, and seemingly determined to push away anyone who tried to help him. Mrs. Henderson walked past Faisal without another word, her heels clicking sharply against the marble. The massive front door closed behind her with a heavy thud that echoed through the mansion like a judge's gavel. Faisal stood alone in the silence that followed, his small victory feeling emptier than he'd expected. If you're enjoying this story and want to see what happens next, please subscribe to our channel. We're just starting out and your support means everything. Hit that subscribe button to help us grow and bring you more incredible stories like this one. The next morning, the sky had cleared to that impossible California blue that made everything seem possible again. Abdullah sat in his study, reviewing yet another stack of applications from nanny agencies. His assistant Marcus had compiled profiles from the most exclusive services in Los Angeles, but Abdullah had little hope. This was the 9th nanny in 6 months. The pattern was always the same. They arrived confident, even cocky about their ability to handle difficult children. Within a week, sometimes less, they were gone. Some angry, some broken, all defeated. "Sir," Marcus said hesitantly from the doorway. He was a young man, efficient and usually unflappable, but even he looked uncertain now. There's someone here. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says she's here about the nanny position." Abdullah looked up, his dark eyes sharp beneath graying temples. "We work through agencies, Marcus. You know that." "I do, sir, but she seems different, and frankly, we're running out of options." Something in Marcus's tone made Abdullah pause. "Send her in." The woman who entered the study a moment later was not what Abdullah expected. She was African-American, probably in her early 30s, with a quiet grace that seemed at odds with her simple appearance. She wore a modest gray dress that had clearly been carefully pressed, and her natural hair was pulled back neatly. Her eyes held something Abdullah hadn't seen in the parade of nannies who'd come before. Not confidence exactly, something steadier, something like purpose. "Mr. Al-Mansour," she said softly, extending her hand. "My name is Grace Williams. I understand you're in need of help with your son." Abdullah studied her for a long moment before gesturing to one of the leather chairs across from his massive mahogany desk. "Ms. Williams, I appreciate you coming, but I should be honest with you. My son is challenging. I've employed nannies with decades of experience, credentials from the finest institutions in Europe and America. None have lasted." Grace settled into the chair, her posture straight but not rigid. "With respect, sir, sometimes experience and credentials aren't what a child needs." "And what does my son need in your opinion?" "I don't know yet," Grace admitted, her honesty disarming. "But I'd like the chance to find out. Every child is different. Every hurt is different. And hurt children often need something that can't be taught in any institution." Abdullah leaned back in his chair, intrigued despite himself. Your resume? I worked as a home health aide for 5 years in Detroit, caring for elderly patients with dementia and Alzheimer's. Before that, I was a teacher's assistant in an inner-city school. I don't have fancy degrees, Mr. Al-Mansour, but I understand pain, and I understand patience. My son doesn't need a therapist. He sees one twice a week already. What he needs is structure, discipline. What he needs, Grace interrupted gently, is someone who won't give up on him. The statement hung in the air between them. Outside, a gardener's leaf blower started up, the distant sound emphasizing the silence in the study. Abdullah made his decision. 1 week. I'll pay you double the standard rate, but if you can't handle Faisal, I expect you to leave without drama. No tears, no recriminations. Can you agree to those terms? Grace met his eyes steadily. I can agree to try my best for your son. That's all I can promise. Then you start tomorrow. Marcus will provide you with everything you need. Living arrangements, schedule, household rules. As Grace stood to leave, Abdullah called out one more warning. Ms. Williams, my son will test you. He will try to break you, just as he's broken all the others. He's learned that if he's cruel enough, people leave, and that's what he wants. To prove that everyone will abandon him eventually, just like his mother did. Grace turned back, her expression soft but resolute. Then I suppose he's never met someone who understands that sometimes the hardest children to love are the ones who need it most. She left the study quietly, leaving Abdullah staring after her with an emotion he hadn't felt in months. Hope. It was faint, fragile, and probably foolish, but it was there nonetheless. Upstairs, Faisal watched from his bedroom window as the woman in the gray dress walked down the mansion's long driveway toward an old Honda Civic that looked absurdly out of place among the luxury vehicles that usually graced the property. He couldn't hear what had been said in his father's study, but he knew. Another nanny, another person who would claim to care, to understand, to help, and then leave when they realized he was too much work. A small, hard smile crossed the boy's face. Good. Let them come. Let them try. He'd show this one, just like he'd shown all the others, that he didn't need anyone, that he was fine alone. The rain had stopped, but Faisal's storm was just beginning. Grace Williams arrived at the Al-Mansour mansion the next morning at precisely 7 o'clock, just as the sun began casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. She'd spent the previous evening in prayer and reflection in her small studio apartment in Inglewood, asking for wisdom and strength. This wasn't just another job. She could feel it in her bones. This boy, this broken child hiding behind cruelty, needed something she wasn't sure she could give, but she'd promised to try, and Grace Williams didn't break promises. Marcus met her at the service entrance, a detail that didn't escape Grace's notice. The front door, it seemed, was reserved for guests of a certain status. She didn't mind. She'd entered through back doors most of her life. Mr. Al-Mansour is already at his office downtown, Marcus explained, leading her through a pristine kitchen where a chef was preparing breakfast. Faisal usually wakes around 8. He's homeschooled. His tutors arrive at 9:30 for lessons until 2. Your primary responsibilities are supervision, ensuring he completes his assignments, takes his meals, and, well, stays out of trouble. Stays out of trouble, Grace repeated softly. That's an interesting way to put it. Marcus paused near a door that led to the main house. His expression shifted, becoming almost sympathetic. Ms. Williams, I feel I should warn you, the boy is— I know what he is, Grace said gently. And more importantly, I know what he isn't. He isn't hopeless, Marcus. Just hurting. Marcus looked at her with the same expression Abdullah had worn the day before, that mixture of hope and skepticism that comes from being disappointed too many times. Your room is in the West Wing, 2nd floor. I'll show you. The room was larger than Grace's entire apartment, with its own bathroom, a sitting area, and windows that overlooked the pool and gardens. It was beautiful and cold, like everything else in this house. Grace set down her single suitcase, everything she owned fit in one bag, and took a deep breath. Lord, she whispered, I'm going to need your help with this one. At 8:15, she heard the first signs of life from down the hall. Doors slamming, footsteps, the muffled sound of someone shouting in Arabic. Grace made her way toward the noise and found Faisal's bedroom door wide open. The room was a study in contradictions. One wall held floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound classics and academic texts that most 12-year-olds would never touch. Another wall displayed expensive gaming equipment still in their boxes, untouched. A telescope stood by the window, pointing toward nothing. The bed was unmade, clothes scattered across imported Persian rugs, And in the center of it all stood Faisal, still in his pajamas, glaring at his phone. "You're late," he said without looking up. His voice carried that same entitled edge she'd heard described. "Breakfast should have been brought to my room 20 minutes ago." Grace didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took in the details Marcus's reports hadn't mentioned. The dark circles under the boy's eyes suggesting sleepless nights, the way his hand trembled slightly as he held his phone, the photograph on his nightstand, partially hidden but visible, of a beautiful woman with kind eyes holding a much younger, smiling Faisal. "Good morning, Faisal," Grace said finally, her voice warm but not artificially cheerful. "My name is Grace. I'm not here to bring you breakfast in bed." The boy's head snapped up, his dark eyes narrowing as they took her in. She watched the calculation happen in real time, the assessment, the categorization, the decision about which weapon to use first. "Another one," he said, his lip curling. "Let me guess. You're going to tell me you're different. You're going to say you understand me. You're going to promise you won't leave like all the others." "Actually, I wasn't going to say any of that," Grace replied, moving into the room and beginning to gather the scattered clothes. "I was going to suggest you get dressed and come downstairs for breakfast. The chef made something that smells wonderful." Faisal watched her, confused by her lack of reaction to his hostility. "You can't touch my things. Mrs. Henderson tried that. I made sure my father fired her." "Mrs. Henderson left because she chose to," Grace said, folding a shirt with practiced efficiency. "Nobody can make your father fire me except your father himself. And I'm not touching your things inappropriately. I'm helping you maintain your space. There's a difference. I don't want your help." The words came out sharp, designed to wound. Grace paused, meeting his eyes directly. "I know you don't, but that's okay. Wanting help and needing help aren't always the same thing." For a moment, something flickered in Faisal's expression. Surprise, maybe, or curiosity. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the familiar mask of contempt. "You'll be gone by the end of the week," he said with absolute certainty. "They all leave. You will too." "Maybe," Grace acknowledged, setting the folded clothes on a chair. "But that's not today's problem. Today's problem is getting you fed and ready for your lessons. So let's start there." She left the room without waiting for his response, her heart pounding but her expression calm. In the hallway, she allowed herself a moment to close her eyes and breathe. This was going to be harder than she'd thought. Breakfast was a disaster, though Grace had expected nothing less. Faisal came downstairs 30 minutes later, dressed in expensive casual wear, but with his shirt deliberately untucked and his hair uncombed, a small rebellion that spoke volumes. He sat at the long dining table where a full breakfast had been laid out. Eggs, fresh fruit, Arabic bread, yogurt, honey, and fresh squeezed orange juice. "I don't eat this garbage," Faisal announced, pushing his plate away with enough force to make the silverware clatter. Grace, who'd been standing near the window, turned calmly. "What would you prefer?" The question seemed to throw him off balance. The other nannies had either argued with him or scrambled to accommodate him. Grace was doing neither. I want McDonald's. I want a Big Mac and large fries." "For breakfast?" "Yes. And if you don't get it for me, I'll tell my father you're refusing to feed me." Grace nodded thoughtfully. "You're certainly welcome to tell your father that, but I'm not going to lie to him if he asks me what happened. I'll tell him I offered you a healthy breakfast prepared by your chef, and you requested fast food instead." Faisal's face reddened. "You work for me." "Actually, I work for your father, and my job is to look after your well-being, not your every whim. There's a difference." "I hate you," Faisal spat, standing abruptly. His chair scraped loudly against the marble floor. Grace felt the words like a physical blow, but she kept her voice steady. "That's your right, but you still need to eat something before your tutors arrive. If you won't eat this food, I can ask the chef to make you some oatmeal or toast. Those are your options." For a long moment, they stood in a silent standoff. Grace could see the war happening behind the boy's eyes, the desire to escalate, to push harder, to prove that he could make her snap like all the others. But something held him back. Maybe it was the complete absence of anger in her demeanor. Maybe it was simple curiosity about how far she'd let him push. Finally, Faisal grabbed a piece of bread and some honey and stalked out of the dining room without another word. Grace released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Small victories, she reminded herself. This was going to be a battle of patience, not force. The morning lessons were a revelation. 2 tutors arrived, Mr. Patterson for mathematics and science, and Ms. Chen for literature and history. Both were clearly excellent educators. patient and knowledgeable, and both were clearly terrified of their student. Grace observed from a corner of the library where the lessons took place. Faisal was brilliant. That much was obvious within minutes. He solved complex algebra problems with barely a glance, recited historical dates and events with perfect accuracy, and demonstrated a vocabulary that would shame most adults. But every correct answer came with a side of condescension. "Are we really wasting time on the Pythagorean theorem?" Faisal asked Mr. Patterson with exaggerated boredom. "I understood this when I was 9. Nevertheless, it's part of the curriculum," Mr. Patterson began. "The curriculum is for average children. I'm not average." Grace watched Ms. Chen flinch when Faisal interrupted her explanation of Shakespeare with a dismissive comment about how the bard was overrated and tedious. She saw Mr. Patterson's jaw tighten when Faisal deliberately gave wrong answers to questions Grace knew he could solve just to waste time. This wasn't just a difficult child. This was a child who'd learned that intelligence could be weaponized, that his brilliance gave him power over the adults around him. And underneath it all, Grace could see what no one else seemed to notice. The boy was desperately, achingly lonely. When the tutors left at 2 o'clock, both looking emotionally drained, Grace found Faisal in the game room, not playing any of the expensive equipment but simply sitting on a leather couch, staring at his phone. "You were unkind to your teachers," Grace said, not as an accusation but as an observation. Faisal didn't look up. "They're paid to teach me. If they can't handle criticism, they should find other jobs." "There's a difference between criticism and cruelty," Grace replied, sitting down on a chair across from him. "You're smart enough to know that. Why do you care?" The question came out bitter. "You're just here for the paycheck like everyone else." Grace was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. "I'm here because your father loves you and doesn't know how to reach you. I'm here because I believe every child deserves someone who won't give up on them, even when they're doing everything possible to push people away." Faisal finally looked up, his young face twisted with something between anger and anguish. "You don't know anything about me." "You're right, I don't. But I'd like to, if you'll let me." "Why?" The word was almost a whisper now. "Why would you want to know me? Everyone else just wants me to behave, to be quiet, to be less." Grace leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Because I don't think you're cruel, Faisal. I think you're scared and hurt. And you've learned that if you hurt people first, it doesn't hurt as much when they leave." The boy's eyes suddenly glistened with unshed tears, but he blinked them away furiously. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Maybe not," Grace conceded. "But I know what it's like to lose someone you love more than anything. I know what it feels like to be so angry at the world that you want to break everything around you just so it matches the broken pieces inside." Faisal stared at her, something shifting in his expression. "Who did you lose?" Grace hesitated, then decided honesty was the only path forward. "My daughter. She was 6 years old. Car accident, just like your mother. That was 8 years ago, but some days it feels like yesterday." The silence that followed was different from the hostile silences that had punctuated the day. This one held weight, shared grief, a tentative connection. "Does it get better?" Faisal asked finally, his voice small and young in a way it hadn't been all day. "It gets different," Grace said honestly. "The pain doesn't disappear, but you learn to carry it. You learn that love doesn't end just because someone isn't physically here anymore. And you learn that closing your heart to everyone else doesn't honor their memory. It just makes you alone in your grief." Faisal looked down at his hands, and when he spoke again, his voice cracked. "Everyone leaves. My mother left. All the nannies left. Even my father. He's here, but he's not really here. He doesn't know what to do with me anymore. So you make sure they leave before they can hurt you," Grace finished gently. "You push and test until they prove what you already believe, that you're too much, too difficult, too broken to love." A single tear rolled down Faisal's cheek, and he wiped it away angrily. "You'll leave too. They all do." Grace stood up slowly and moved to sit on the couch beside him. Not too close, respecting his space, but close enough that he could feel her presence. "Faisal, I can't promise I'll be here forever. Life doesn't work that way. But I can promise that if I leave, it won't be because you're too difficult or because I gave up on you. It will only be if your father decides my services are no longer needed, or if something beyond my control happens. I won't leave just because you're having a hard time. That's not who I am." The boy didn't respond, but Grace noticed that he didn't pull away either. They sat in silence as the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, two people bound by loss, beginning the slow, difficult work of trust. Outside, the gardeners continued their work. The pool cleaner hummed and the world carried on, indifferent to the small miracle happening in the game room of the Al Mansour mansion. When Abdullah came home that evening, Marcus reported that it had been a quiet day. What he meant was that nothing had been broken, no one had quit, and Grace was still there. Abdullah found Grace in the kitchen, helping prepare dinner despite the chef's polite protests that it wasn't necessary. "Ms. Williams," he said, his tone unreadable. "I trust Faisal wasn't too challenging?" Grace turned, wiping her hands on a towel. "He's a remarkable boy, Mr. Al Mansour. Brilliant, insightful, and carrying more pain than most adults could handle." Abdullah's expression softened slightly. "That's a diplomatic way to describe what I'm sure was a difficult day." "Every day with healing is difficult," Grace replied, "but that doesn't mean it's not worth doing." That night, for the first time in months, Faisal didn't demand that his dinner be brought to his room. He came downstairs and ate at the table with his father and Grace, mostly in silence, but it was a start. And when Grace went to her room that night, she found a small note slipped under her door, written in careful handwriting. "Thank you for not leaving today." Grace pressed the note to her chest, tears streaming down her face, and whispered another prayer, this time one of gratitude. The real work was just beginning. The following days unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance between two people learning each other's rhythms. Grace quickly discovered that Faisal's cruelty operated on patterns. It intensified when he felt vulnerable, when something reminded him of his mother, or when his father was due home, and the boy braced himself for the inevitable distance between them. On Wednesday morning, Grace found Faisal already awake at 6:30, sitting on the balcony outside his room in the pre-dawn darkness. She'd learned to wake early, to be present before the boy's defenses fully activated for the day. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked softly, stepping onto the balcony with 2 cups of hot chocolate. She'd learned from the chef that Faisal's mother used to make him hot chocolate every morning, a tradition that had died with her. Faisal stiffened at her presence but didn't send her away. That alone was progress. "I don't need you to check on me like I'm a baby." "I know you don't," Grace said, setting 1 cup on the small table beside him. "I made myself some and thought you might like one too. But if you don't want it, that's fine." She turned to leave, employing the strategy that had proven most effective, offering without demanding, giving him space to choose connection rather than forcing it upon him. "Wait," Faisal said quietly. You can stay, if you want." Grace settled into the chair beside him, and they watched in silence as the sky slowly transformed from deep indigo to soft pink and gold. Los Angeles stretched out before them, the city just beginning to stir, the distant hum of early morning traffic like a lullaby in reverse. "She used to make this for me," Faisal said finally, his hands wrapped around the warm cup. "Every morning before school, she'd tell me stories about when she was young in Riyadh, about my grandparents, about—" His voice trailed off, "about how much she loved you." Grace finished gently. Faisal nodded, and Grace saw his jaw tighten as he fought back emotion. "It's been 3 years. Everyone says I should be over it by now. My father never talks about her anymore. It's like she never existed." "Grief doesn't have a timeline," Grace said, her voice carrying the weight of personal experience. "And your father's silence doesn't mean he's forgotten. Sometimes people go quiet because the pain is too loud inside them. They don't know how to share it without drowning in it." "Is that what you did when your daughter died?" The question was direct, almost challenging, but Grace heard the real inquiry beneath it. "Tell me I'm not alone in this. Tell me what I'm feeling is normal." "For a while, yes," Grace admitted. "I stopped talking to people. I stopped going to church. I stopped doing anything that reminded me of Lily. I thought if I could just freeze everything, make the world stop, maybe the pain would stop too." "Did it work?" "No. Pain doesn't work that way. It finds you whether you're running from it or standing still." What finally helped was realizing that remembering her didn't have to only hurt, that I could think about her laugh, her curious questions, the way she'd dance in the kitchen while I cooked. I could remember all of that and feel sad, yes, but also grateful that I'd had her at all. Faisal was quiet for a long moment, staring into his cup. "I dream about her sometimes. In the dreams, she's still alive, and I wake up and for just a second I forget. And then I remember, and it's like losing her all over again." Grace's heart ached for this child carrying such enormous grief. "Those dreams are a gift, Faisal. They're your mind's way of keeping her close. The pain of waking up is real, but so is the joy of being with her, even in a dream." The other nannies never wanted to talk about her. They'd change the subject or tell me to focus on moving forward or some other stupid phrase that doesn't mean anything. I'm not other nannies, Grace said simply. And your mother deserves to be remembered, talked about, celebrated. Love doesn't end because someone dies. It just changes shape. As the sun fully rose, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, something shifted between them. Faisal didn't smile. Grace suspected genuine smiles were still far off, but his shoulders relaxed slightly, and he didn't pull away when Grace's hand briefly touched his shoulder in a gesture of comfort. We should get you ready for your lessons, Grace said eventually. But Faisal, anytime you want to talk about your mother, I'm here to listen. No subject is off limits with me. The boy nodded, and as they stood to go inside, he said quietly, her name was Layla. Layla Al-Mansour. Everyone called her Lulu. Lulu, Grace repeated, honoring the name. That's beautiful. What was she like? And for the first time since Grace had arrived, Faisal really talked about his mother. The words came haltingly at first, then in a rush. He told Grace about how his mother had been a professor of literature in Riyadh before she married, how she'd loved American poetry, despite his father's family thinking it was too Western, how she'd taught Faisal to read English and Arabic simultaneously, weaving between languages like they were music. By the time Mr. Patterson and Ms. Chen arrived for lessons, something fundamental had shifted. Faisal was still reserved, still guarded, but the sharp edges of his cruelty had dulled slightly. The tutors noticed immediately. When Faisal corrected Mr. Patterson's minor mathematical error, he did so without the usual condescension. When Ms. Chen asked him to analyze a poem by Robert Frost, he engaged thoughtfully rather than dismissively. Your mother loved Frost, didn't she? Grace asked during a break, remembering something Faisal had mentioned that morning. Faisal looked up, surprised that Grace had been paying attention. Yes. The road not taken was her favorite. She said it reminded her of leaving Saudi Arabia to marry my father. She took the road less traveled. Ms. Chen, overhearing this, brightened. Would you like to analyze that poem for your literature assignment? I think your personal connection to it would make for a compelling essay. For a moment, Grace worried that Faisal would retreat, would see this as an invasion of his private grief, but instead he nodded slowly. Okay, but I want to do it justice. Can I have extra time? It was the first time he'd ever requested more work rather than fighting to do less. That afternoon brought an unexpected test. Abdullah called from his office to inform Grace that he'd be working late. A major deal required his attention, and he wouldn't be home until after 10. Grace could hear the guilt in his voice, the apologetic tone of a father who knew he was choosing business over his son once again. When she told Faisal, she braced for an explosion. This was exactly the kind of trigger that had sent the boy into destructive rages with previous nannies. Instead, Faisal simply nodded, his expression carefully neutral. Of course he is. There's always a deal, always something more important. The words were bitter but controlled. No screaming, no throwing things, no deliberate destruction. Progress, Grace thought, though she recognized the hurt beneath the calm. Your father loves you very much, Grace said carefully, but I think he doesn't know how to show it. Some people express love through providing, through working hard to ensure security. It's not the same as presents, I know, but it comes from the same place. You don't have to defend him, Faisal said sharply. I'm not a child who needs fairy tales about how my absent father actually cares. You're right, Grace agreed, surprising him again with her honesty. I don't have to defend him, and you're not wrong to feel hurt by his absence. Both things can be true. He loves you deeply, and his way of showing it isn't what you need. Those aren't contradictory. Faisal studied her for a long moment. You're strange. You know that? You don't act like other adults. How do other adults act? Like they have all the answers. Like if I just do what they say, everything will be fine. Like my feelings are problems to be solved instead of just feelings. Grace smiled slightly. Well, I definitely don't have all the answers, but I do know that feelings aren't problems. They're information. They tell us what matters to us, what hurts us, what we need. Ignoring them doesn't make them go away, it just makes them louder. Is that something you learned in school? No, I learned that in therapy. After Lily died, I thought I was going crazy. I'd get angry at random things, cry at commercials, feel nothing when I thought I should feel everything. A counselor helped me understand that grief doesn't follow a schedule or make logical sense, it just is. Faisal absorbed this information, his brilliant mind clearly processing. Did you ever get angry at your daughter? For dying? The question was so raw, so vulnerable, that Grace knew they'd reached a crucial moment. Her answer could either build trust or shatter it. Yes, she said honestly. I was furious with her, which made no sense because she was 6 years old and it wasn't her fault that a drunk driver ran a red light. But I was angry anyway. Angry that she left me. Angry that I had to keep living without her. Angry that the world kept turning when mine had stopped. And did the anger go away? Eventually, once I let myself feel it completely instead of feeling guilty about feeling it. Anger is often just grief in disguise. We get angry because we loved so much, and the loss feels unbearable. Faisal's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I was angry at her, at my mother, for dying, for leaving me with my father who doesn't know how to talk to me anymore, for not being here to make everything okay. And I felt terrible about it, like I was betraying her memory by being angry. "Oh, sweetheart," Grace said softly, using the endearment without thinking. "Being angry at your mother doesn't mean you love her any less. It means you miss her so much that your heart can't figure out what to do with all that love that has nowhere to go." The dam broke. Faisal, who'd held himself together through 3 years of grief, who'd driven away every adult who tried to help, who'd built walls so high no one could reach him, this boy finally wept. Not the angry tears of a tantrum, but the deep, wrenching sobs of a child who'd been holding on too tight for too long. Grace moved to sit beside him on the couch, and when Faisal collapsed against her, she held him the way she used to hold Lily during nightmares, the way she wished someone had held her when her own world shattered. She didn't offer platitudes or try to stop his tears. She simply held him and let him break, knowing that sometimes breaking is the first step toward healing. "I miss her so much," Faisal sobbed into Grace's shoulder. "I miss her every day, and it never stops hurting, and I don't know how to make it stop." "You don't make it stop, honey. You learn to carry it, and you don't have to carry it alone." They sat that way for nearly an hour, Faisal crying out years of accumulated grief while Grace held him steady. When the storm finally passed, the boy pulled back, embarrassed and exhausted. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, wiping his face. "I didn't mean to." "Don't apologize for feeling," Grace interrupted gently. "Ever. Not to me, not to anyone. Your feelings are valid, Faisal. All of them. The other nannies would have told my father I had a breakdown. They'd say I'm unstable, that I need more therapy, more medication, more. I'm not telling your father anything except that you're doing the hard work of healing. And that takes more courage than pretending to be fine ever could." Faisal looked at her with something approaching awe. "Why are you different?" "I'm not different, sweetheart. I've just been where you are. I know what it's like to hurt so badly you want to hurt everyone else, so they'll understand even a fraction of your pain. And I know that what you need isn't someone to fix you. You're not broken. What you need is someone to be present while you find your own way through." That evening, Faisal helped Grace prepare dinner, something he'd never done before. The chef was initially flustered by the boy's presence in his kitchen, but Grace encouraged it, showing Faisal how to chop vegetables, measure spices, stir the pot of chicken stew she was making. "My mother used to cook," Faisal said, his voice thoughtful rather than sad. "She said it was meditation, that the repetition of chopping and stirring helped her think clearly." She was right, Grace agreed. There's something healing about feeding people you care about. It's love made tangible. When Abdullah finally arrived home at 10:30, exhausted from his long day of negotiations, he found something that stopped him in his tracks. Faisal and Grace sitting at the kitchen table, playing a board game and laughing softly over something. Laughing. His son was laughing. Abdullah stood in the doorway, afraid to move and break the spell. Faisal looked up and saw his father, and for a moment the old wariness returned to his expression. But then Grace said something quietly to him, and Faisal nodded. "Hi, Dad," the boy said, his voice careful but not hostile. "Grace made stew. There's some left if you're hungry." Abdullah felt his throat tighten with emotion. I'd like that very much." As Grace served him a bowl of stew and Faisal returned to their game, Abdullah caught Grace's eye. She gave him a small, encouraging nod, a silent message. "Be patient. He's trying." That night, after Faisal had gone to bed, Abdullah found Grace in the kitchen cleaning up. "Ms. Williams," he said formally, though his voice shook slightly. "I don't know what you did today, but thank you. I haven't seen him like that. Calm, almost happy, since before his mother died. I didn't do anything, Mr. Al-Mansour. I just gave him space to feel what he's been holding inside for 3 years. The others tried to manage his behavior." Grace interrupted gently. "I'm trying to understand his heart. There's a difference." Abdullah nodded slowly. "Whatever you're doing, please continue. Money is no object. If you need anything, more help, different resources, time off. What I need, Grace said carefully, is for you to spend time with your son. Not quality time or scheduled activities. Just time. Sit with him. Listen to him. Let him see that you're still here, even if his mother isn't. Abdullah flinched as if she'd struck him. I don't know how to talk to him about Layla. Every time I try, His voice broke. You're grieving too, Grace said softly. And Faisal needs to see that. He thinks your silence means you've forgotten her, moved on. He needs to know you're still hurting too, that he's not alone in his pain. I can't, Abdullah whispered. If I let myself start, I'm afraid I won't stop. I have to be strong for him. Strength isn't the absence of pain, Mr. Al-Mansour. It's being honest about it. Your son doesn't need you to be strong. He needs you to be human. Abdullah stood there, this powerful man who commanded boardrooms and negotiated billion-dollar deals, and for the first time in 3 years, he allowed himself to cry in front of another person. Grace simply stood beside him, a steady presence, until the storm passed. I'll try, he said finally. I don't know if I can do what you're asking, but I'll try. That's all anyone can do, Grace replied. Upstairs, Faisal lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in 3 years, he felt something other than anger or numbness. He felt hope. It was fragile and frightening, but it was there. And in her room, Grace knelt beside her bed and prayed, not just for Faisal and Abdullah, but for herself, because she was beginning to realize that healing this broken family was healing something inside her too. The walls she'd built around her own heart were beginning to crumble, and she wasn't sure if that was terrifying or wonderful, or somehow both at once. The moon rose high over Beverly Hills, casting silver light across the mansion's grounds, and 3 wounded souls slept more peacefully than they had in years. The real transformation had begun. The breakthrough came on a Sunday afternoon, 2 weeks after Grace's arrival, when everything seemed to unravel in the most unexpected way. Abdullah had actually taken the morning off, a rarity that didn't go unnoticed. He joined Faisal and Grace for breakfast, and though the conversation was stilted, filled with awkward pauses and careful politeness, it was progress. But by noon, an emergency call from Dubai demanded his attention, and he retreated to his study with apologetic glances that Faisal pretended not to see. Grace found the boy in the library, staring at a photograph album he'd pulled from a high shelf, one she suspected hadn't been opened in years. His mother smiled from every page, young and radiant, holding a baby Faisal, then a toddler, then a young boy with bright, uncomplicated joy in his eyes. She was so beautiful, Grace said softly, sitting beside him. Faisal's finger traced his mother's face in one photograph. I'm forgetting things about her. Her voice. I used to be able to hear it perfectly in my head, but now it's getting fuzzy. And her laugh. I'm forgetting her laugh, Grace. His voice cracked on her name. That's one of the cruelest things about grief, Grace said gently. The fear that forgetting the small details means losing them all over again. I can't lose her again. I can't. Faisal's breathing quickened, panic rising in his chest. What if I forget everything? What if she just disappears? Grace took his hand, grounding him. She won't disappear, Faisal. She lives in you, in your love of poetry, in the way you think, in your intelligence and your passion. Those are all gifts she gave you. But if you want to remember her voice, there might be a way. Faisal looked up, hope and fear warring in his expression. How? Does your father have videos of her? Phone recordings? Home movies, anything? The boy's eyes widened. I don't know. He never watches them. He put everything away after she died. Grace stood. Decision made. Come with me. They found Abdullah still on his video call, speaking rapid Arabic into his computer. Grace knocked gently on the study door. Abdullah looked annoyed at the interruption, but something in Grace's expression made him pause. I need a moment, he said into the camera, then muted himself. Ms. Williams, this is important. So is your son, Grace interrupted, her voice firm but not disrespectful. Faisal needs to see videos of his mother. He's forgetting her voice and it's breaking his heart. Whatever is happening in Dubai can wait 5 minutes while you show your son where those memories are kept. Abdullah's face went pale. I can't. Those are private. They're his mother, Grace said quietly. He has a right to remember her. Faisal stood in the doorway watching this exchange with wide eyes. No one had ever challenged his father like this. No one had ever put Faisal's needs above Abdullah's business. Abdullah looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw the desperate longing there. He saw perhaps for the first time how much his own grief had stolen from Faisal. In trying to protect himself from pain, he'd locked away everything that could have comforted his child. "Wait here," Abdullah said hoarsely. He unmuted his call, spoke briefly in Arabic, and ended the meeting despite protests from the other participants. Then he crossed to a cabinet in the corner of his study, one that had remained locked for 3 years. Inside were boxes of photographs, USB drives, and an old laptop. Abdullah's hands trembled as he opened the laptop and navigated to a folder labeled simply Layla. "I haven't looked at these since." He couldn't finish the sentence. Grace moved to stand behind him, one hand on his shoulder, the other beckoning Faisal closer. "Maybe it's time you both remembered together." Abdullah clicked on the first video. The screen filled with color and movement. A birthday party, Faisal's 9th birthday. Layla's voice rang out melodious and warm, singing in Arabic. The camera was shaky, clearly handheld, capturing a younger Faisal blowing out candles while his mother laughed with pure joy. "Again, Habibi, make another wish," Layla's voice said, and Faisal in the video grinned and pretended to blow out the candles once more. In the study, Faisal made a sound between a sob and a laugh. "I remember that day. She made me blow out the candles 3 times because she said I deserved 3 wishes." Abdullah's face was wet with tears he didn't bother to hide. "She always said you deserved the world." They watched video after video, Layla reading to Faisal before bed, her voice soft and soothing. Layla teaching him to ride a bike in their compound in Riyadh, encouraging him in Arabic and English. Layla and Abdullah dancing in their living room while young Faisal giggled from the couch. "You never dance anymore," Faisal said quietly to his father. "You used to dance with her all the time." Abdullah's voice was barely a whisper. "I couldn't. Without her, the music stopped. But she'd want you to keep dancing, Dad. She'd want both of us to keep living." It was the first time in 3 years that Faisal had called him Dad instead of father. The first time warmth had crept back into that word. Abdullah pulled his son into an embrace, and for the first time since Layla's funeral, they wept together. Not separately, not behind closed doors, but together. 2 people united in loss and love. Grace quietly stepped out of the study, giving them privacy for this sacred moment. She stood in the hallway, her own tears falling freely, and whispered a prayer of gratitude. Hours later, as the sun began to set, Grace found them still in the study. They'd moved through grief into memory, and now Faisal was telling his father stories about school, about his tutors, about the book he was reading. Abdullah listened with complete attention, his phone silenced, his laptop closed. "Ms. Williams," Abdullah called when he saw her. "Please, join us." Grace entered to find both their faces transformed, still sad, but no longer hollow. They'd touched their grief together and survived it. "Thank you," Abdullah said simply, "for reminding me what matters." That evening, they ordered pizza, Faisal's choice, and ate it in the living room while watching one of Layla's favorite movies. It wasn't healing exactly. Healing would take much longer, but it was the beginning of something new, a family learning to live with loss instead of being destroyed by it. As Faisal dozed off on the couch, his head on his father's shoulder, Abdullah looked at Grace with wonder. "How did you do this? In 2 weeks, you've given me back my son." "I didn't give him back, Mr. Al-Mansour. He was always here. You both just needed permission to find each other again." "Stay," Abdullah said suddenly, urgently. "Please, not just for a week or a month. Stay with us. Faisal needs you. We need you." Grace smiled softly. "I'm not going anywhere. That's a promise." Outside, the Los Angeles night sparkled with possibility, and inside the Al-Mansour mansion, 3 hearts beat a little lighter than they had in years. The transformation wasn't a fairy tale with a neat linear progression. Real healing never is. The days following that Sunday brought moments of profound connection, interspersed with setbacks that tested everyone's resolve. But something fundamental had shifted in the Al-Mansour household. The willingness to try, to be vulnerable, to believe that change was possible. On Monday morning, Faisal woke early again, but this time not from nightmares or restless grief. He found Grace already in the kitchen preparing breakfast alongside the chef, who'd grown accustomed to her presence and even seemed to enjoy the company. "I want to do something," Faisal announced without preamble. "Something my mother would have wanted." Grace turned, wiping flour from her hands. She'd been learning to make Arabic bread, wanting to bring more of Faisal's heritage into their daily routine. "What did you have in mind?" Faisal pulled out his phone, showing her photographs of a community center in downtown Los Angeles. My mother used to volunteer here before I was born. She taught English to immigrants, helped refugees navigate their new lives. My father donated money after she died, but she would have wanted more than money. She would have wanted presents. Grace's heart swelled with pride. This was the boy people had called unreachable, cruel, hopeless. What are you thinking? I want to volunteer there. Teach kids English or math or whatever they need. My tutors say I'm ahead of most high school students anyway. Maybe I could actually use all this education for something that matters. That's a beautiful idea, Faisal. Have you talked to your father about it? The boy's expression clouded slightly. He'll say it's not safe, or that I'm too young, or that we can just send more money instead. Or, Grace said gently, he might surprise you. People can change, sweetheart. Your father is trying, just like you are. Give him the chance to show up for you. That evening, when Abdullah returned from work at a reasonable hour, another small miracle Grace had been praying for, Faisal approached him nervously in his study. Dad, I need to talk to you about something. Abdullah set down his reading glasses, giving his son his full attention. This too was new, the deliberate choice to prioritize presence over productivity. Of course, what is it? Faisal explained his idea, his words tumbling out in a rush of passion and nervousness. He showed his father the photographs, explained his mother's connection to the center, articulated his desire to honor her memory through action rather than just grief. Grace watched from the doorway, ready to intervene if necessary, but hoping desperately that Abdullah would rise to this moment. Abdullah was quiet for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then he said, "Your mother would be so proud of you." Faisal's eyes widened. "So, I can do it?" "On one condition," Abdullah said. "I come with you, at least for the first few times. Not because I don't trust you, but because I want to be part of this. I want to honor your mother's memory too, and I've spent too long hiding from the things that remind me of her." Faisal's face broke into the first genuine smile Grace had seen from him. Wide, unguarded, radiant. "Really? You'd come with me? Really?" Abdullah stood and embraced his son, and Grace quietly slipped away to give them privacy, her heart full. The following Saturday, they drove to the community center together, Abdullah, Faisal, and Grace. The building was in a neighborhood that contrasted sharply with Beverly Hills. Working class, diverse, vibrant with the energy of people building new lives in a new country. Children played in a small courtyard, while adults attended English classes in converted classrooms. The center's director, Mrs. Rodriguez, was a woman in her 60s with warm eyes and hands that had clearly done hard work. She remembered Layla with obvious affection. "She was a light in this place," Mrs. Rodriguez said, her accent carrying the music of her native Colombia. "Always patient, always kind. She never made people feel stupid for not knowing English. She celebrated every small victory like it was a miracle." Faisal listened, hungry for these stories of his mother that he'd never heard. What was she like here? Was she different than at home? Mrs. Rodriguez smiled. "She was exactly the same, mijo. Genuine, you know. Some rich people come here to feel good about themselves, take pictures for their social media, then disappear. Your mother came because she believed every person deserved dignity and opportunity. She saw people, not projects." They toured the facility, cramped classrooms with mismatched furniture, a library with outdated books, a computer lab with aging equipment. Abdullah, who routinely approved budgets in the millions without blinking, saw the need with new eyes. But more importantly, he saw the people, families working multiple jobs while learning English, children doing homework in corners because their apartments were too crowded, teenagers translating for their parents with weary competence. "We need more than money," Abdullah said quietly to Mrs. Rodriguez, "though I'll certainly provide that. We need people who care." "That's what your wife understood," Mrs. Rodriguez replied. "Money helps, yes, but presence changes lives." Faisal was immediately drawn to a group of children his age, mostly refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, and Central America. They were practicing English with a volunteer, struggling with pronunciation and grammar. Without prompting, Faisal sat down with them. "The sound is tricky," he said, his voice patient, so different from the condescending tone he'd used with his own tutors. "It's not in Arabic or Spanish. You put your tongue between your teeth like this. Thank you." The children tried, laughing at their own mistakes, and Faisal laughed with them. Not at them, but with them. Grace watched from across the room, tears streaming down her face as this boy who'd been called cruel and unreachable showed his true nature. Compassionate, empathetic, capable of profound kindness when given the right outlet. One child, A small Syrian girl named Amira, with dark curls and solemn eyes, was particularly struggling. She'd been silent through the entire lesson, her body language screaming trauma and fear. Faisal noticed what the adult volunteer had missed. "Hey," he said softly, switching to Arabic. "It's okay if you don't want to speak. Learning a new language is scary." Amira's eyes widened at hearing her native tongue. She responded haltingly, explaining that her family had fled Aleppo, that she'd watched her school bombed, that speaking English felt like betraying her home. Faisal's expression was gentle, understanding. "My mother was Arab too. She taught me that learning English didn't make me less Saudi. It made me more equipped to share our culture with others. Your Arabic doesn't go away when you learn English. You just become bigger, able to hold more of the world inside you." Grace, watching this exchange, realized that Faisal was processing his own grief through helping others. He understood what these children were experiencing: the loss of home, the fear of forgetting, the pain of displacement. His mother's death had been a different kind of refugee experience, forcing him to navigate a world without her guidance. By the end of the day, Faisal had helped 3 children with their homework, taught basic algebra to a teenager preparing for high school, and convinced Amira to try speaking a few English words. He was exhausted but glowing with purpose. On the drive home, Abdullah said, "I'd like to make this a weekly commitment. Saturdays here as a family. Is that agreeable to both of you?" Faisal turned to his father with shining eyes. "You mean it? Every week?" "Every week," Abdullah confirmed. "Your mother dedicated her Saturdays to this place. It seems fitting that we do the same in her memory." That night, Faisal wrote in a journal for the first time since his mother's death. Grace found him at his desk, pen moving rapidly across paper, and quietly asked if he was okay. "Better than okay," Faisal said, looking up. "I'm writing to my mother, telling her about today. My therapist always suggested it, but it felt stupid before. Now it feels necessary." "What are you telling her?" Faisal's voice was soft but steady. "That I finally understand what she was trying to teach me all along. That privilege isn't about having more than others. It's about using what you have to help others have more. That kindness isn't weakness. That the measure of a person isn't what they have, but what they give." Grace squeezed his shoulder gently. "She knows, sweetheart. Wherever she is, she knows, and she's so proud of you." The following weeks brought routine, not the sterile, disconnected routine of before, but a meaningful rhythm that grounded them all. Weekday mornings meant breakfast together, lessons with tutors who now faced an engaged student rather than a hostile one, afternoons of homework and conversation. Evenings meant dinner as a family, sometimes sharing stories about Layla, sometimes talking about the day's events, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence. Saturdays belonged to the community center. Faisal quickly became a favorite among the children there, his natural intelligence and hard-won empathy making him an exceptional tutor. Abdullah, meanwhile, began meeting with other professionals and business owners, organizing a network of support that went beyond financial donations, job training programs, mentorship opportunities, scholarship funds. Grace watched them both blossom, but she also noticed the toll that emotional work takes. One evening, 3 weeks after their first visit to the center, she found Faisal crying quietly in his room. "What's wrong?" she asked, immediately concerned that he'd regressed. "Amira's family is being deported," Faisal said through his tears. "Immigration rejected their asylum claim. They have 30 days before they have to leave. She'll have to go back to Syria, Grace, back to the place that traumatized her, and there's nothing I can do to stop it." Grace sat beside him, her own heart breaking. "Oh, Faisal, I thought if I helped, if I cared enough, I could fix things. But I can't fix this. I can't save her family. I'm useless." "No," Grace said firmly. "You're not useless. You're learning one of life's hardest lessons, that loving people doesn't mean you can protect them from every pain. You gave Amira weeks of safety, of feeling seen and valued. You helped her believe that the world still holds kindness. That matters even if you can't change her circumstances. It doesn't feel like enough." "It never does," Grace admitted, "but it's still something, and sometimes something is all we can offer." Faisal was quiet for a moment, then said, "My mother couldn't protect me from losing her, but the love she gave me before she died, that's what's carried me through. Maybe that's what I gave Amira. Maybe years from now, when she's struggling, she'll remember that a boy in Los Angeles saw her, valued her, believed in her. Maybe that memory will help her keep going." Grace pulled him close, amazed at his wisdom. "You're exactly right. That's exactly right." That weekend, Faisal and Abdullah met with an immigration attorney, one of the best in California, Someone Abdullah could afford, but Amira's family couldn't. They couldn't stop the deportation, but they could ensure the family had resources, connections to organizations in Syria that could help them, and a contact in the US who would continue advocating for them. It wasn't a happy ending. Real life rarely offered those, but it was an act of love, of refusing to turn away from suffering even when you couldn't eliminate it. On Amira's last day at the center, Faisal gave her a gift, a journal like his own with a note written in Arabic inside the cover. Your story matters, your voice matters. Don't let anyone silence you, and remember, someone in Beverly Hills thinks about you, prays for you, and believes you'll do amazing things. Amira hugged him tightly. This boy who'd shown her that wealth doesn't determine worth, that kindness transcends circumstances, that people from completely different worlds can still recognize each other's humanity. That night, Abdullah found Grace in the kitchen, where she seemed to do her best thinking while cooking. Ms. Williams, Grace, I need to tell you something. Grace turned, concerned by his serious tone. What is it? When you first arrived, I thought you were just another caregiver, someone to manage my son while I managed my business. I was wrong. Abdullah's voice was thick with emotion. You didn't just help Faisal. You helped me remember what matters. You showed me that presence is more valuable than presence, that vulnerability is strength, that love requires showing up even when, especially when, it's painful. Mr. Al-Mansour, please call me Abdullah, and please let me finish. He took a breath. I want to establish a foundation in Layla's name. Not just writing checks, but actually doing the work she believed in. Education, refugee support, community development. And I want you to help run it. Not as Faisal's nanny, but as a partner in this work. You have wisdom that can't be bought or taught. You understand what people need because you've needed it yourself. Grace was speechless. I don't have the credential, neither did my wife when she started. She just had compassion and courage. The same things you have. Please, Grace, help me turn my wealth into something meaningful. Help me teach Faisal that our privilege comes with responsibility. Help me honor Layla's memory in a way that would make her proud. Grace felt tears streaming down her face. This job had started as simple employment, a way to survive after years of just existing, but it had become something more, a calling, a purpose, a chance to transform her own pain into something redemptive. Yes, she said simply. I'd be honored. Upstairs, Faisal had fallen asleep with his journal open beside him, pen still in hand. He'd been writing to his mother again, telling her about Amira, about his father's change, about Grace. The last line read, I used to think you abandoned me, Mama, but I understand now. You didn't leave me. You taught me everything I needed to survive your absence. You gave me compassion, intelligence, faith, and goodness. And then, you sent Grace to remind me of those gifts when I'd forgotten them. I miss you every day, but I'm not angry anymore. I'm grateful. I'm so grateful I was your son. The moon rose over Beverly Hills, casting silver light through the windows, and in the Al-Mansour mansion, 3 people slept peacefully, not because their pain had disappeared, but because they'd learned to carry it together. Healing, Grace thought as she drifted off to sleep, isn't about forgetting the hurt. It's about remembering that love survives even death, that connection transcends loss, that broken people can help other broken people become whole. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, there was peace. 6 months had passed since Grace Williams first walked through the doors of the Al-Mansour mansion, and the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The house that had once echoed with tension and silence now hummed with life, laughter, and purpose. But the true test of their journey came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, when everything they'd built was suddenly threatened. Grace was at the community center with Faisal, supervising his tutoring session with a group of newcomer children, when her phone rang. It was Marcus, his voice tight with urgency. Grace, you need to come back to the house immediately and bring Faisal. Her heart seized. What's wrong? Is Abdullah okay? He's fine, but there's a situation. Mrs. Al-Mansour's family has arrived from Saudi Arabia. They're demanding to see Faisal, and they're not happy about you. Grace understood immediately. She'd known this confrontation was coming eventually. Abdullah's late wife came from a prominent traditional Saudi family who'd never approved of her volunteer work, her progressive views, or her American influences. After Layla's death, they'd wanted Faisal sent to boarding school in Riyadh, raised properly within their cultural traditions. Abdullah had refused, but the tension had never fully resolved. We'll be there in 20 minutes. Grace said, ending the call. Faisal looked up from helping a young boy with fractions, immediately reading the concern on her face. What's wrong? Your mother's family is at the house. Your grandparents, I think, and maybe others. The color drained from Faisal's face. They've come to take me away, haven't they? They've been threatening it for years. They think my father is raising me wrong, that I'm becoming too Western, too— Hey, Grace interrupted gently, crouching to his eye level. No one is taking you anywhere. You're not a possession to be claimed. You're a person with your own voice, and whatever happens, we'll face it together. Your father loves you, I'm here for you, and you're strong enough to handle this. Okay? Faisal nodded, but Grace could see the old fear creeping back into his eyes. The terror of abandonment, of losing what little stability he'd found. She squeezed his hand as they gathered their things and headed to the car. The drive back to Beverly Hills was tense. Faisal stared out the window, his jaw clenched, the progress of the past month seeming to evaporate under the weight of family obligation and cultural expectation. Grace, he said quietly, If they make my father send me away, I want you to know. You changed my life. You showed me that I'm not broken, just hurt, and that there's a difference. No one is sending you anywhere, Grace repeated firmly, though her own heart was racing. She knew the power of family in traditional cultures, the weight of obligation and honor. She knew that as a Black American woman with no formal credentials, her influence was fragile against the force of bloodlines and heritage. When they arrived at the mansion, 3 expensive cars filled the circular driveway, black Mercedes sedans with diplomatic plates. Grace and Faisal entered through the front door to find the living room filled with people. Abdullah standing rigidly near the fireplace, and arranged on the various couches and chairs were 5 members of the Al-Mansour family. Faisal's grandfather, Sheikh Khalid Al-Mansour, was an imposing figure in traditional Saudi dress, a pristine white thobe and red-checked gutra. His wife, Faisal's grandmother Noura, sat beside him in an elegant black abaya, her face visible but her expression severe. 3 uncles, Layla's brothers, completed the delegation, all watching with calculating eyes. The temperature in the room seemed to drop when Grace and Faisal entered. Faisal, Sheikh Khalid said in Arabic, his voice commanding. Come here, boy. Let me look at you. Faisal hesitated, then walked forward slowly. His grandfather studied him with a mixture of affection and disappointment. You've grown, the Sheikh said, but I hear troubling things. Your father tells me you've been spending time in poor neighborhoods, teaching refugee children, involving yourself with people beneath your station. Grace felt anger flare in her chest, but she remained silent, waiting to see how this would unfold. Faisal's voice was quiet but steady. I've been honoring my mother's memory, grandfather. She volunteered at that center. She believed in helping people regardless of their status. Your mother, Sheikh Khalid said, his tone softening slightly, was a good woman who had some unconventional ideas. But she's gone now, and it's time for you to embrace your true heritage. Your father has indulged your grief long enough. We've come to bring you home to Riyadh, where you belong. This is my home, Faisal said, his voice trembling but firm. One of the uncles, a man named Khalid, spoke up sharply. Don't be disrespectful to your grandfather. You're 12 years old, a child. You don't decide where you belong. Abdullah finally spoke, his voice tight with controlled emotion. Faisal stays here, we've discussed this before. This is his home and I'm his father. You're failing as a father, Noura said, speaking for the first time. Her English was accented but clear. Look at him, thin, pale, undisciplined. And this woman, she gestured dismissively at Grace. This stranger raising our grandson, it's shameful, Abdullah. Layla would be horrified. Grace felt the words like a slap, but before she could respond, Faisal's voice rang out stronger than before. Don't speak about my mother like you knew her. The outburst shocked everyone into silence. You didn't approve of her choices when she was alive. You tried to control her, to make her into something she wasn't. And when she died, you wanted to do the same to me. Well, I won't let you. Faisal, Abdullah started, but his son continued. My mother taught me that dignity isn't about status or wealth. She taught me that everyone deserves respect, regardless of where they come from. And Grace. His voice broke slightly. Grace taught me that it's okay to grieve, to feel, to be human. She didn't try to fix me or change me. She just loved me when I was completely unlovable. So don't you dare insult her in my presence. The room was absolutely silent. Sheikh Khalid's face had turned red. Whether from anger or something else, it was hard to tell. Then, unexpectedly, it was Noura who spoke, and her voice had lost some of its edge. Tell me about this woman, Faisal. Why does she matter so much to you? Faisal looked at Grace, his eyes shining with unshed tears, then back to his grandmother. Because she saw me. Not my behavior, not my potential, not what I could become, just me. Exactly as I was. Angry, hurt, impossible to deal with. And she stayed anyway. Grace stepped forward, her voice calm and respectful. Mrs. Al-Mansour, I understand your concerns. I'm not Saudi. I don't share your culture or religion, and I have no prestigious credentials. But I do understand loss. I lost my daughter 8 years ago, and that pain taught me how to recognize it in others. Your grandson was drowning in grief, lashing out because he didn't know how else to process the loss of his mother. He didn't need discipline or distance, he needed someone to anchor him while he learned to swim through his pain. Sheikh Khalid studied Grace with sharp eyes. And you believe you've fixed him? No, sir. I don't believe people need fixing. Faisal was never broken. He was grieving. There's a profound difference. I simply gave him space to feel everything he was feeling without judgment, and permission to remember his mother without guilt. Noura's expression had softened, almost imperceptibly. What do you mean? Without guilt? Faisal felt guilty for being angry at his mother for dying. Grace explained gently. He felt guilty for struggling when he had every material comfort. He felt guilty for not being the son he thought everyone wanted him to be. I helped him understand that grief is messy and complicated, and that all his feelings, even the ugly ones, were valid. One of the uncles scoffed. This is Western psychology nonsense. In our culture, children are taught strength, not to wallow in feelings. With respect, Grace said, her voice still calm but carrying steel underneath. Denying feelings doesn't make someone strong. It makes them brittle. Faisal was breaking under the weight of unexpressed grief. Now he's learning to bend without breaking. That's real strength. Abdullah moved to stand beside Grace and Faisal, a united front. My son has transformed in the past 6 months. He's compassionate, engaged, purposeful. He honors his mother's memory through action, not just words. Grace didn't erase Layla from his life. She helped him keep her alive in the ways that matter most. Sheikh Khalid stood, his imposing height making him tower over the room. For a long moment, no one breathed. Then he turned to his wife. Noura, what do you think? The question surprised everyone. In traditional Saudi families, the patriarch's word was typically final. But Layla's mother had loved her daughter fiercely, and grief had perhaps opened her heart to possibilities she'd once rejected. Noura stood and walked slowly to Faisal. She placed her hands on his cheeks, studying his face with grandmother's eyes that saw beyond cultural expectations to the child she loved. You look like her, she said softly in Arabic. You have Layla's eyes, her spirit. When your mother was young, she wanted to change the world. We tried to teach her that wasn't her place. We were wrong. Her voice cracked. She died before we could tell her we were wrong. Tears streamed down Faisal's face. She knew you loved her, grandmother. She told me you did things differently because you wanted to protect her. Noura pulled him into an embrace, and for the first time since entering the house, she looked fully human, rather than formidable. When she pulled back, she turned to Grace. My daughter chose her own path, and it made her happy. Perhaps my grandson should have the same choice. She looked at her husband. Khalid, the boy is thriving. Can we not see that? Sheikh Khalid was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, Faisal, come here. The boy approached his grandfather nervously. The old man placed a hand on his shoulder. Your grandmother is wiser than I am, a fact I'm learning in my old age. I came here believing I knew what was best for you, but I see now that you're finding your own way, honoring your mother in a manner she would appreciate. He glanced at Grace. Ms. Williams, I owe you an apology. I judged you without knowing you, which is neither fair nor wise. Grace inclined her head gracefully. No apology necessary, Sheikh Al-Mansour. You were protecting your grandson. I understand that impulse. Nevertheless, the Sheikh continued, I would like to understand better what you've done here. Perhaps you would share a meal with us. Tell us about this community center, this foundation my son is establishing. What followed was an evening that none of them would forget. Over a dinner prepared by the chef with consultation from Noura about traditional Saudi dishes, Faisal told his grandparents and uncles about the community center, about the children he tutored, about Amira, and the lessons he'd learned about privilege and responsibility. Abdullah spoke about the foundation he and Grace were developing, about how they were working to channel his wealth into meaningful change, rather than just charitable donations. He spoke about Layla with love and longing, opening up to her family in a way he never had before. bridging the gap that grief had created between them. And Grace shared her own story, about Lily, about the long journey through darkness toward light, about how helping Faisal had helped her heal in ways she'd never expected. By the end of the evening, when the Al Mansour family prepared to return to their hotel, the atmosphere had completely transformed. Sheikh Khalid pulled Abdullah aside and spoke quietly. "My son, you're doing well by the boy, better than I gave you credit for. And this woman, she's remarkable. Don't let her go." Abdullah smiled slightly. "I have no intention of it." Nora hugged Faisal tightly before leaving. "I'll visit more often," she promised. "And perhaps you can show me this community center. Teach me about this work your mother would have loved." "I'd like that, grandmother," Faisal said, and meant it. After they'd left, the three of them, Abdullah, Faisal, and Grace, collapsed in the living room, emotionally exhausted but victorious. "I thought I'd lost you," Faisal admitted to Grace. "I thought they'd send me away and we'd never see each other again." Grace pulled him close. "I told you I'm not going anywhere. You're stuck with me, kiddo." Abdullah watched them, his heart full. "Grace, I need to ask you something formally. I'd like to make you Faisal's legal guardian alongside myself, not just an employee but family. Someone with actual legal standing to protect him if anything ever happens to me." Grace's eyes widened. "Abdullah, that's an enormous responsibility. One you've already been fulfilling for 6 months. I want it official. I want Faisal to know that your place in his life is permanent, protected. Will you accept?" Grace looked at Faisal, saw the hope shining in his eyes, and felt something shift in her own heart. She'd thought that part of her that could mother, that could love a child deeply, had died with Lily. But love, she'd learned, isn't a finite resource. It expands, transforms, finds new expressions. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I accept." Faisal launched himself at her, hugging her with the full force of a 12-year-old who'd learned to love again. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for not giving up on me." "Never," Grace whispered back. "Not then, not now, not ever." 2 years later, the Layla Al Mansour Foundation held its annual gala at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. The event raised millions of dollars for refugee education and support, drawing celebrities, business leaders, and philanthropists from around the world. But the moment that made headlines wasn't a celebrity appearance or a major donation. It was when 14-year-old Faisal Al Mansour took the stage to speak about his mother's legacy. He was poised and articulate, his voice steady as he told the story of a boy who'd been lost in grief and found by an unexpected angel. He spoke about Grace without sentimentality, but with profound love, explaining how one person's patience and compassion had transformed not just his life, but his entire family's trajectory. "My mother taught me that we honor the dead not by preserving them in amber," Faisal said, "but by living the values they held dear. She believed in dignity, in education, in the fundamental equality of all people. This foundation continues her work, but more importantly, it represents a choice, the choice to transform pain into purpose, grief into growth, privilege into service." In the audience, Abdullah sat beside Grace, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. On Grace's other side sat Nora, who'd become a surprising ally and friend, a grandmother finally getting to know her grandson without cultural barriers in the way. Backstage after his speech, Faisal found Grace. "Did I do okay?" "You were perfect," Grace said, pulling him into a hug. "Your mother would be so proud. I'm so proud. I couldn't have done any of this without you," Faisal said seriously. "You know that, right? You saved my life, Grace." "No, sweetheart," Grace corrected gently. "You saved your own life. I just held your hand while you did the hard work." That night, as they drove home through the glittering Los Angeles streets, Grace reflected on the impossible journey they'd traveled. She'd arrived at the Al Mansour mansion broken, grieving, uncertain if she had anything left to give. She'd found a boy everyone had labeled impossible, a father drowning in his own pain, a household suffocating under the weight of loss. And somehow, through patience, love, and the willingness to be vulnerable, they'd built something beautiful. Not a fairy tale. Real life was messier than that. Faisal still had hard days. Abdullah still struggled to balance work and presence. Grace still mourned Lily, but they'd learned to carry their pain together, to honor their losses without being destroyed by them, to love even when love felt risky and uncertain. Years later, when Faisal graduated from Stanford with a degree in education and social policy, he dedicated his thesis to two women, his mother, Layla, who'd taught him to dream, and Grace, who'd taught him to heal. And when he opened his own school for refugee children, a place where trauma-informed education met cultural celebration, where no child was considered impossible or unreachable, he named it the Layla and Lily Learning Center. Because some stories don't have neat endings. They have beginnings that bloom in unexpected places, watered by tears and tended by hands that refuse to give up. Grace stood at the school's opening ceremony, surrounded by the family she'd found in the most unlikely place, and whispered a prayer of gratitude. She'd arrived at the Al-Mansour mansion believing she was there to save a broken child. Instead, she'd discovered what she should have known all along. Broken people don't need saving. They need someone willing to sit in the brokenness with them, to hold space for their pain, to remind them that cracks are where the light gets in. And sometimes when two broken people find each other, they don't become whole. They become something better. They become real, authentic, fully human in all their beautiful, messy, imperfect glory. The Saudi millionaire's son had been cruel to all the nannies, but he'd never met someone like Grace Williams who understood that cruelty is often just love turned inside out, desperately seeking expression. And in the end, it wasn't money or status or power that healed them. It was simply this: one person refusing to walk away when walking away would have been easier. One person choosing love when love seemed impossible. One person believing that every child, no matter how hurt, how angry, how impossible they seem, deserves someone who won't give up on them. That belief changed everything. 10 years after Grace first walked through those mansion doors, she stood in the garden of a small house in Pasadena, her own house, purchased with money she'd earned as co-director of the Layla Al-Mansour Foundation. The garden was modest compared to the Beverly Hills estate, but it was hers, filled with roses she'd planted herself and a bench where she sat each morning with her coffee. Today was special. Faisal was bringing someone to meet her. At 22, he'd grown into a remarkable young man, tall like his father, with his mother's compassionate eyes and a quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who he was. He pulled up in his sensible Toyota, and Grace smiled. Despite his family's wealth, Faisal had chosen simplicity, living in a studio apartment near his school, driving a used car, spending his trust fund on scholarships rather than luxuries. The young woman who stepped out beside him was beautiful, not in a glamorous way, but with an authentic warmth that reminded Grace of Layla. Syrian, Grace guessed immediately, and her heart knew before Faisal spoke. Grace, he said, his voice thick with emotion, I want you to meet Amira. Yes, that Amira. We reconnected 3 years ago through the Foundation's refugee network. She made it back to the States for college. Amira embraced Grace like she was family. Thank you, she whispered. Faisal told me what you did for him, how you taught him to see people like me as human beings worth knowing. That lesson changed both our lives. They sat in the garden, drinking tea, sharing stories. Amira spoke about her journey, the years in Syria, the eventual return to America, her scholarship to UCLA. Faisal held her hand with a tenderness that spoke of deep love built on shared understanding of loss and resilience. We're getting married next year, Faisal announced. And Grace, I need to ask you something. Will you walk me down the aisle? My father will be there, of course, but you're the one who taught me what love actually means, what it looks like when it's real and difficult and worth fighting for. Grace's tears fell freely. I would be honored. Later, after they'd left, Grace sat alone in her garden as the sun set over Pasadena. She thought about Lily, who would have been 16 now. She thought about Layla, who'd never know how profoundly her son had honored her legacy. She thought about all the broken pieces that had somehow formed a beautiful mosaic. Her phone buzzed. A text from Abdullah. Thank you for everything, Grace. You gave me back my son, and you taught us both how to live again. Grace smiled, typing back simply, You did the work. I just believed in you. Above her, stars began appearing in the darkening sky, and Grace whispered to the people she'd loved and lost, Look what we built from our brokenness. Look how love survived. And in the gentle evening breeze, she swore she could hear them whispering back, We see. We're proud. And you were never alone. Some stories end. Others transform into new beginnings. This was both. Thank you for allowing me to tell Faisal and Grace's story. This narrative explored themes of grief, healing, cultural identity, and the transformative power of unconditional presence. The story showed that real change doesn't come from grand gestures or quick fixes, but from consistent, patient love that refuses to abandon people in their darkest moments.